Welcome back, everyone. Spring and summer is a time for new growth and taking bold action together. So we hope these stories can inspire you to live boldly, take wise chances, and with our friends and family, make a difference together. Today we will be reading The Adventures of Wishbone, Digging to the Center of the Earth by Michael Anthony Steele, inspired by A Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. So lean in with a spirit of adventure, grab a friend, and let's enjoy the story together. Chapter 10. The sturdy raft sailed across the central sea for 2 more days before the travelers reached land, and there's no Dramamine, might I add. When the 3 travelers finally brought their craft ashore, Axel checked on their supplies and equipment. Many were lost overboard during the terrible struggle between the 2 ancient beasts. Hans made repairs to the raft, for they didn't know if this was the right port in which to continue following Sagnussen's trail. Professor Lindenbrock looked over the new land. He was thrilled to have his paws on solid ground. It felt good to be off what seemed to be a never-ending sea. Professor Lindenbrock did recalculate, however, the central size of sea. It was more than 1,800 miles wider than Europe's Mediterranean Sea. And that was just the distance that they had crossed. For all they knew, the mysterious sea that lay underneath the Earth's crust could be as much as 10 times that in length. Either way, the professor hoped they wouldn't find that out. His calculations completed, Professor Lindenbrock watched as Axel finished making his check of their supplies. Well, Axel, Professor called his nephew, what do we have left? Axel looked up to his uncle from the beach below, where he had laid out their supplies. Then he walked up the small hill to where his uncle stood. We have 4 months' worth of food and water, Axel answered. Then he added, that's if we use everything carefully. 4 months, cried the professor with glee. Then we shall have plenty of time to complete our journey. He reared onto his hind legs for a moment. With what will be left over, I plan to give a grand dinner to my 2 traveling partners when we return. Professor Lindenbrock then turned his back to the sea. He raised his muzzle and sniffed the slight breeze blowing across the hills. The land that they had reached looked very much like the land where their sea voyage had begun. Scary-looking cliffs rose to meet a high granite ceiling above, and on each side of them the beach stretched way into the distance. Eventually, it was swallowed by a distant fog created by a combination of sea spray and low-lying underground clouds. Professor turned back to face Axel. Come, dear nephew, he said. While Hans repairs the raft, let us go on a journey of discovery. We shall see if we are still on the great Sagnussen's path. Professor and Axel walked along the beach, their feet and paws crunching over shells of every shape and size. There was evidence of sea life from every period of creation stretched along the shore and in the neighboring dunes. They even discovered empty giant turtle shells. One was so huge the professor was easily able to walk into the center of it. Its former inhabitant had long since passed on to take its place with the rest of the extinct species. The remains of ancient, or not so ancient, sea life were only part of what was to be found in this new area. After walking about a mile along the shore, the pair came across another huge field of bones. Once again, every species in the history of animal life seemed to be represented, and the huge bone cemetery spread out in front of them. With a dry, crackling sound, the professor's paws crushed the remains of species that major museums would have thought to have. Then Axel picked up and held before him one of their greatest discoveries yet, a human skull. Finding a human skull this many miles below the Earth's surface was an incredible discovery. To the professor, the skull was special. It was more than 3 million years old. For many years, scientists have been trying to prove that mankind existed that long ago, and right there in front of the professor's eyes was the proof. He gazed around and saw more specimens from that ancient era. Once again, Professor Lindenbrock had to ask himself how these incredible specimens had ended up so many miles into the Earth's crust. Had these people fallen through the Earth to their death? Or had they survived the terrible fall into the core of the Earth and continued to live out their lives there beneath the soil? This discovery was very similar to the mastodon bones they had seen some days ago. Could these people also be wandering the shores of this sea? Axel, Professor said, breaking their surprised silence, put this specimen into your bag. My fellow scientists back in Hamburg will be amazed to see this souvenir from our journey. Axel did as his uncle instructed. He carefully placed the skull into the specimen bag he kept slung around his neck. Come, the professor continued, let us keep searching. It seems that every discovery we make is more fantastic than the one before. They continued their walk along the beach. Then they saw the stone cliffs fall back to reveal a huge alcove. Climbing the sandy dunes, Professor and Axel made their way towards the giant cave. When they reached the top of a connecting dune, they saw that the professor's predictions about making more great discoveries had come true once again. Spread out before them and reaching as far as they could see into the giant cave was an underground forest. This was not like the forest they saw earlier. It was a collection of palms, cypress, and conifers, or cone-bearing trees. All of them were connected by a twisted mass of creeping plants. A lush carpet of moss and ferns covered the ground. Trickling brooks flowed beneath the huge trees. This was one of the most unusual, spectacular sights one would expect to see so many miles beneath the Earth's surface. As the two examined the vegetation, the professor saw many different species. All of them have three things in common. Axel, can you look here and find even one species of tree or shrub that has not been extinct above ground for at least 1,000,000 years? Professor Lindenbrock asked his amazed nephew. Cannot say that I can, Axel replied. Uncle, did you also notice that the vegetation is all a similar color? Brownish and faded looking, and that it has no odor to it at all? Yes, interesting fact, said the professor. The soft moss felt good and welcoming beneath Professor Lindenbrock's paws. Still, he made his way through the forest with caution. After what they'd experienced in the middle of the Central Sea, this underground paradise could end up being the home of other mighty beasts as well. He lifted his nose into the cool breeze, searching for clues. Wasn't quite sure what he was searching for. His nose was used to picking up smells on the Earth's surface. Still, he took in all the new aromas with delight and wonder. Together, the professor and his nephew walked through what was turning out to be a huge jungle. Axel examined each of the different species and recorded information about them in a small notebook. The professor continued to make his way through the dense vegetation. His keen hearing picked up a distant noise that sounded like a tree falling. He looked over at Axel and realized his nephew had not heard the noise. He was in the middle of cataloging an ancient brush. Professor Lindenbrock looked back to where the sound had come from. He leapt over a small brook and nosed his way through a large fern. Then he was looking out into a large clearing. There he saw the source of the noise. He watched in the distance as several 14-foot brown fur-covered elephants pulled at tree leaves and low-lying bushes with their mighty trunks. Mastodons, Professor said to himself. Huh? Incredible! He turned back to call for Axel. His nephew was already creeping towards him. Axel's eyes were wide and his mouth was gaping open. He was speechless at the fantastic scene they were witnessing. Mastodons, Professor repeated. He continued in a hushed tone. It is an entire herd of them. They are not fossils, not just a collection of bones, but living, breathing, eating mastodons. A tree trunk cracked loudly and then fell directly in front of them. One of the herd's members had been feeding so close to the professor and Axel's side of the clearing that they had not noticed him. The mighty creature paused no more than 15 feet away from the travelers. Its sad eyes looked at both of them for any signs of danger. After it found none, its long trunk wrapped itself around one of the fallen tree limbs and quickly stripped it of most of its leaves. The giant beast then plunged the leaves into his mouth. It chewed with great energy. Still, the animal kept a careful watch on the two explorers. Professor Lindenbrock slowly began to move. He wanted to get an even closer look at the ancient creature. Axel quickly placed a steadying hand on his uncle's back. Professor turned in order to see why Axel had stopped him. Axel, eyes wide open, pointed his finger towards a huge clearing. Professor Lindenbrock followed Axel's gaze. What he saw was almost too hard for him to believe. Not more than a quarter of a mile away, leaning against the trunk of an enormous tree, was a human being. But it wasn't just any human being. This man was an absolute giant, capable of driving and guiding the herd of huge mastodons that grazed before him. His height was over 12 feet. His head, as big as the head of a buffalo, was lost in a mane of matted hair. A mighty hunter stalking one of these creatures, Axel said, his voice trembling with a touch of fear. No, Axel, Professor whispered. Look at the larger branch in his hand. Surely he uses such a tool to guide his mighty herd. He is a shepherd, my dear boy. Suddenly, the skull they had found on the ground in the bone cemetery was no longer just an old fossil. It was once a part of the body of someone who had died only recently. These people were living here and now. This was their time. This was their world. Now the professor and Axel were the ones out of place. Axel, let us leave this area, said the professor. He slowly backed farther into the forest. We might be seen by the giant shepherd at any moment. Let the only one who knows we were here be this powerful mastodon that stands chewing before us. Carefully, both the professor and Axel made their way back through the underground forest and to the beach. During the walk back to the beach, the professor and Axel said nothing to each other. Professor Lindenbrock was too busy trying to make sense of the wonders they had just seen. He supposed Axel was doing the same. It all seemed absolutely impossible. It seemed as if their ears and eyes had tricked them somehow. How could any human being have possibly existed in this underground world? But then again, how could two ancient dinosaurs from millions of years ago do battle with each other in the present day? There seemed to be no end to the astonishing discoveries that would make their journey. They returned to their raft. Hans had almost completed his repairs. As the professor and Axel approached the guide, Hans reached into a pocket and pulled out a rust-covered dagger. He turned the handle towards Axel and then offered it to him. Axel took the dagger. Hans turned his attention back to the raft. Is that your dagger, Axel? The professor asked. What made you bring along such a useless weapon? I've never seen this before, Axel replied, and I've never seen it carried by Hans either. Are you sure it is not from your own collection? Not that I know of, said the professor, puzzled. It was never my property. Axel kneeled, letting his uncle examine the dagger more closely. Then what can it be? Axel asked. Could it be the weapon of some ancient warrior or of some friend of that mighty shepherd from whom we have just escaped? Professor Lindenbrock sniffed the dagger carefully. The rust on this weapon is not a day old, not a year old, not a century old, but much more, he exclaimed. His tail began to wag as the idea struck him. Professor then backed up and looked at his nephew. Axel, he cried, we are now on the verge of another great discovery. He looked back at the dagger. This blade that Hans has discovered was left on the sand more than 300 years ago. This dagger was a 16th century weapon carried by a gentleman. But who brought it here? Axel asked. It didn't get here by itself. A man brought it here, the professor replied, his tail wagging much faster. It is the same man who has probably written his name somewhere with this very dagger. It is a man who has tried once more to point the way towards the right path to the interior of the earth. Professor Lindenbrock took off towards the stony cliffs that lay just above over the dunes. Let us look around. You have no idea of the importance of this great discovery. With Axel not far behind, Professor Lindenbrock ran over the dunes and up to one of the cliff walls. Together, they searched along the wall for any sign of the previous meeting with humanity. Professor scanned the wall for any marks. He also sniffed the ground, trying to pick up any scent at all, no matter what its age was. At last, under a huge overhanging rock, they discovered the entrance of a dark and gloomy tunnel. There on the wall were 2 letters. They were the initials of the brave and extraordinary traveler who had gone before them on their adventurous journey. A.S. Professor Lindenbrock cried. His front 2 paws rested just under the faded letters. You see, I was right! Arne Sakusum! Arnie Sakusum. The professor backed away from the wall. For a moment, he was speechless. But that doesn't happen very often. He took 2 quick steps and then leapt into the air, spinning his body completely around and landing on all 4s. Wonderful and glorious genius, great Sakusum! He cried with glee. You have engraved your initials at every important stage of your journey. Your mark leads the hopeful traveler directly to the great and mighty discoveries to which you have such energy and courage. The brave traveler shall follow your footsteps to the last, and I'm sure we will find your initials engraved with your own hand upon the center of the earth itself. I will be that brave traveler. I, too, will carve my initials above the very same spot. Forward, forward, Axel cried in a burst of true and strong enthusiasm. He started in the direction of the new tunnel. Be patient and calm, dear nephew, the professor said. It almost seemed as if their roles had become reversed. Let us return to our good friend Hans and bring our supplies to the entrance. They left the spot where the old initials had been carved and turned towards the beach. Let us leave this level sea, Professor Lindenbrock said. We shall descend, and forever continue to descend. Do you know, my dear boy, that to reach the very center of the earth, we have only 4,900 miles left to travel? Oh, only. Bah, Axel cried. The distance is scarcely worth thinking about. They both laughed as they traveled back to Hans and their raft. As they walked, the professor became filled with joy over their new discovery. Even the uncovering of the initials seemed to be unimportant compared to his nephew's fresh sense of courage and adventure. Professor looked up at Axel. He saw a smile on his face, and the young man was bursting with excitement. It seemed that after coming into contact with great mushrooms, thrashing dinosaurs, ancient forests, great herds of mastodons, and a 12-foot tall human, Axel had begun to appreciate the true meaning of their expedition. They reached Hans, gathered their supplies, and began the next part of their trek without delay. This time, Axel led the way. 3 travelers climbed the sandy dunes that separated them from their new tunnel. When they reached the entrance, Professor and Hans switched on their Ruhmkorff coil to light up the dark tunnel. Then once again, Axel, Professor Lindenbrock, and Hans stepped inside a dark tunnel, heading ever closer towards the center of the Earth. Began to follow the passageway in a straight direction. Then, after taking about 12 steps forward, they had to stop. An enormous granite boulder blocked the entire tunnel. The travelers peered to the left and to the right for another passage, but there was none. They looked above and below the mighty boulder for any kind of opening. Again, there was none. "Oh, this miserable stone," Axel said angrily, pounding on the huge rock. Professor Lindenbrock walked anxiously back and forth in front of the giant granite barricade. Hans simply seated himself calmly on a rock, the kind he always seemed able to find. "What about Arne Sakusum?" Axel asked his uncle. This remark pulled the professor out of his silent thoughts. "You're right," he replied. "He would never have been stopped by a lump of rock." "No, 10,000 times no," Axel replied with great determination. "This lump of rock is a result of some underground earthquake that happened long after Sakusum had passed through here. He never met this challenge. If we do not overcome it, then we're unworthy of following in the footsteps of the great explorer. We will be unable to find our way to the center of the Earth." Professor Lindenbrock's enthusiasm was renewed by his nephew's wise words. "Well," he said, his tail wagging wildly, "let us go to work with pickaxes and crowbars, with anything that we can get our hands on." "The rock is far too solid and too big to be destroyed by a pickaxe or a crowbar," Axel replied. "What then?" the professor asked. "No ordinary tools can be used on such a rock," Axel said. "What we need is gunpowder." "Yes," Professor Lindenbrock cried. "We must get rid of the stumbling block." He turned to Hans. "To work, Hans, to work!" Their guide slid his pack off his back. He opened it and pulled out a huge crowbar. With that, he began to dig a hole under the rock. It was a difficult task. It had to be done, though. Hans dug a hole large enough to hold 50 pounds of powerful gun cotton, a substance 4 times as powerful as ordinary gunpowder. While Hans worked, the professor watched Axel pour a long trail of gunpowder out of the tunnel and along the granite wall. This gunpowder would be their fuse. When Hans was finished, Axel placed the explosive gun cotton into the hole. Everything was in place. The 3 eager adventurers, I don't know how eager Hans is, but prepared to continue their journey. Professor Lindenbrock and Hans left the tunnel and took their place upon the raft. Axel followed them out. Then he prepared to light the long fuse he had poured into the cavern floor. From the raft, the professor and Hans watched Axel. He struck a match across the granite wall, then touched it to the end of the line of gunpowder. There was an immediate flash as the powder ignited. A long column of smoke rose into the air from the tiny bright flame that danced along the black trail of powder leading into the tunnel. Axel ran quickly to the shore and hopped into the waiting raft. Once he was on board, Hans hoisted the sail in order to get as far away from the explosion as possible, to safely avoid the falling rock. When the professor believed they had sailed far enough away from the shore to be safe, he told Hans to lower the sail. Once the sail was down, each of them waited impatiently for the coming blast. "Now then," Professor cried, "mountains of granite crumble beneath the power of man!" "Wow, thrashing dinosaurs, herds of mastodons, and a giant caveman. I didn't know all that stuff was under the surface of the Earth. I'd better remember not to bury my toys too deep. I don't want any mastodons reaching up and chewing on my squeaky book." That does it for Chapter 10. We'll see you soon for Chapter 11.